And the nature side, we left off talking about how the males that had these physical and personality characteristics tended to have better access to mates and were more attractive to females and also good at providing to those females. And in this vein, the nature side has a poster child or a champion, and that is Genghis Khan. You might pronounce it Genghis Khan. Either is, of course, fine. And Genghis Khan is the famous Mongol conqueror whose claim to fame, among others, is having put together the largest contiguous land-based empire in the history of the world. 8. And this gave him certainly access to mates. He was most definitely what we would call socially dominant. He has approximately in excess of 380 million male descendants. Now, the number of female descendants is probably about the same, but because of how chromosomes and chromosomal DNA get handed down, we can't be as certain about that. And this translates in at least 16 different populations within Asia. So some of these different pieces on this map. There might be multiple populations of particular ethnic groups in different parts of a single country, but in those populations, nearly 1 in 10 of the males are the direct descendants or heirs of Genghis Khan. Now, I don't want to overstate this because there is a tendency, the way this works, for kind of family trees to collapse in on themselves over time. So other powerful rulers of the past, like Charlemagne, also have huge numbers of descendants. But Genghis Khan is still exceptional. And we can see that even if we want to not talk about these large numbers of descendants down to the modern day, if we just look at what Genghis Khan did in his own lifetime, he was prodigious. We don't have stellar records, but it is likely that he fathered hundreds of sons all by himself. Well, not all by himself. It does take 2. I'll leave that for your child development class. But we're not talking about grandsons and great-grandsons. We're talking about people who could have called Genghis Khan Dad. Bless you. Now, as persuasive a poster child as that might be, we need our evidence to be rather a bit more systematic. So we'll look at some of the more scientific evidence piled up by the nature side. And their first claim we're going to consider is differences in behavior and how early in life those differences begin to manifest. The nature side tells us that these differences emerge early because they are differences that begin even before we're born. We have different development between males and females based on how much testosterone they're exposed to in utero or before birth. And as a result of this, the nature side argues, young male children have a preference to play with mechanical things, right? Toy cars, maybe it's tool sets, right? Any of that kind of thing. Whereas young females will prefer more social forms of play. Might be playing house, but much, much earlier even, it is caring for a doll.
Much different from a male.
And I mean, I certainly do remember my daughters packing around baby dolls that were nearly as big as they were. as they were just starting to walk. Whereas my son did not do those things. Not that he never had anything to do with dolls, but certainly not as frequently as my daughters. Now, so far, you could just argue, well, I mean, they're just like working back from what they observe and making a conjecture that it's based on different testosterone exposures. Well, they're not. What they argue and what they provide evidence to support is that in the case of young female children who were exposed to unusually high levels of testosterone before being born, we see preferences for toys that are very close to what we would see in young male children. And the nature side says this is not a fluke. This preference persists even if the people caring for these females encourage them to play with toys more associated with the preferences of girl children. And this might be parents, daycare workers, preschool teachers, grandparents. So what the nature side is saying, even when nurture is pushing against nature, right, nature wins out, and that these young females continue to behave more with what would be expected of boys. Much related to this, monkeys. Male and female monkeys have toy preferences and different toy preferences that closely match those of human children, which tells us, according to the nature side, that these choices and preferences are not due to socialization. Monkeys are social mammals. They often have pretty sophisticated social structures, but they do not have socialization as humans do. We're not. Nope, we're not supposed to. Third up in the evidence compiled by the nature side are physical differences between males and females. Males do tend to be physically bigger and stronger. Oh, that's okay. Yep, Casey. No, that's okay. That's all right. Now, for some reason, it's this third point that often gets me into trouble. Well, maybe not me so much, but it gets people riled up. This is just typical things. As I've already mentioned today, kind of by accident that this is happening, right? As a hobbit-sized human, right, I certainly realize there are quite a few females out there who are bigger and stronger than I am. We're just talking about general tendencies here. We're always going to find exceptions. Yeah, no, that it came in there too. And more importantly for the nature side, these physical differences also are not just the things that are visibly apparent. Also argue that males and females have distinct brains. And the brains of males are usually larger than the brains of females. Now, males don't get too excited. Having a larger brain does not make you more intelligent. Brain size doesn't have that much to do with intelligence. I mean, unless we get to like the extremes, like people who are born with disorders like microcephaly, right? At which point, that's a horrible abnormality, and those children will need help and special care for the rest of their lives. Those are extremes, but in general, brain size does not matter for intelligence in any measurable, significant way. What is more important is that the connections between parts of the brain, anterior and posterior, right, front and back, and side to side, are different. Those of you who have studied in a human anatomy class, or maybe at some point in a science class you dissected a sheep brain, you can see it's easier to see those side-to-side connections because there are two hemispheres of the brain, and often in those dissections you split it in half. The front to back parts of the brain are harder to see, but the nature side argues that men have more connections from the front of their brains to the back of their brains. These patterns of neurological connections are associated with stronger visual spatial abilities. So kind of seeing how interrelated parts go together, right? Even when those parts are disassembled. Yeah. Right. So this, the nature side argues, means that men tend to be better at mechanical tasks, and related to that, engineering. So the same kind of brain visual spatial abilities that make a mechanic good at figuring out how to get the starter off the engine, right? How to get the starter back onto the engine. Also lend themselves to engineering, designing the engine block and the starter to begin with. But it's not just mechanical things. Part of that being able to see how it all comes together can go into management consulting. These are the people who get paid huge amounts of money to go in and tell executives what to do to make their companies run more efficiently and more profitably. On the flip side, proponents of the nature argument say that women, and they point to evidence that women have more connections from side to side between the hemispheres. And this makes women better at both intuitive and analytical tasks. And that translates into skill at accounting, and also being legal secretaries, paralegals, more commonly called today. Also things for the social sciences, which definitely require that mix of intuition and analytical thinking. All right, and if some of you are thinking, well, that's why Dr. Brown is a horrible social sciences teacher. This should be a woman doing this job. Well, there you go. Science is on your side. And also the less glamorous, but very important, details-oriented forms of management like logistics. So like maybe managing a regional component of FedEx or UPS or the Postal Service. And as you might have noticed, right, there's differences in pay for these kinds of things. Right? A management consultant makes much more than a logistics manager most of the time. Right? Engineers are going to make more than a legal secretary. Right? Accountants can make good money, though.
It seems like the gap is closing a little bit.
It is. Well, partly because males in this country increasingly, this isn't going to be a story about college, although women are far more likely now than males to go to college. But males also just aren't working. Like the labor force participation rate for males in this country is just low. There are tons of men who just don't work. It's not that they're too old, they just don't work. We got some, need to fix this. I'm not sure why we have so many duplicates. Okay, but as I'm sorting out those duplicates, this cartoon is meant to illustrate this difference in the brains. Right? Both the boy and the girl are working on model airplanes. The boy is just visualizing in his head what the parts are going to come together to create, and he just starts building. The instructions are still in the box. The girl, on the other hand, not as visual spatial, but analytical, follows the steps. They'll both get to the same result, but by different means because of different brains. That is also, yes. Yeah, so there's a little bit of kind of maybe a judgmental aspect to that as to which skills are better. Maybe, Emma, you think? Quite possible. No, it's just a repeat. Now, I do want to say, before we move on to the nurture side, that if we look at some of those things, it might lead some of you to suspect, well, these nature side science people are all just a bunch of sexist old men. Some of them might be. But where I was first introduced to a lot of this was by a woman named Valerie Hudson, who, very sharp, started out as a mechanic in the Army, went on to get a PhD in political science. Her children had, I think it was some disorder on like the autism spectrum, I think. But whatever it was, she didn't like the state of medical knowledge as it existed for her kids, and so she decided she would research these things, and she was good enough at it that she was able to publish in an academic medical journal. So she's kind of an all-rounder, and again, she was the first place I was exposed to a lot of these arguments. So don't assume that it's just sexist males coming up with some of these differences. All right, and with that, switch to the nurture side. The nurture side tells us, as you might expect, that this is all about the force of society, not biology, not physiology. And that is because, from the perspective of the nurture side, biological differences between males and females are very minor. They are limited to a narrow range of physical differences. They're not saying that physical differences don't exist. Obviously, reproductive organs and secondary sex characteristics are different. Build and strength do tend to be different. They're not disputing that. I mean, some of this you can very much see in the bone structure of males and females. On the left, we have the male pelvis, and on the right, the female. Different shapes, different construction, because the male pelvis does not have to allow for live birth of a baby. And the nurture side also acknowledges that the brain size difference is real. But it tells that none of these physical differences explain the separate genders that we observe in the social world. Not even those brain differences. They tell us instead, right, that we should think of the brain in really one of two ways. And if we want to think about it kind of from the sociologist's perspective, the brain is a non-gendered thing, much more like a blank slate. And this is kind of what we would expect from the nurture side. And from a more biological perspective, they would say think of it as intersex, right? Not clearly imprinted as male or female at birth. What the nurture side argues is that the brains of males and females are effectively undifferentiated until exposed to the social world. But they do argue that those social stimuli start very early and have effects very early. Before a child is halfway to their first birthday, that baby can distinguish men from women. And I'd also observe differences between men and women at a behavioral level, not just in appearance. Yes, Emma.
I've seen like babies and children that like prefer one gender over the other.
Yeah.
Like there's some babies who would gravitate towards women, and when they see men, they're kind of like, "You stay over there."
Yes. Yep. Nope. That's.
I have a cousin that's
Amazing
only 4, and I've seen
different.
a hook over that.
Yeah. No, and that's really pretty common, and especially like babies. A lot of babies will prefer females to males,
Yeah.
and especially noticeable if the male has like a beard. Beards apparently are terrifying to babies. Yeah, no, apparently. I mean, that's. I'm just thinking of a baby at my church who, like, I just don't look at him because if I make eye contact, right, he just starts to cry, and he does this with. I know you guys are probably thinking, well, that's because you're an awful human being, and you've established this over the course of most of a semester. It's not just that, guys. This kid's never been in my classroom, and he does this to some of the other men in church who have beards, except for my wife's cousin. Babies love that guy. I don't know what it is. Maybe he has a soul and I don't. I think that could be it, Will. Don't be afraid to answer that, Will. I am the destroyer of dreams. No, I know. It's okay. Yeah. No, I've used it to my advantage sometimes. My wife's cousin, different cousin, they had a baby, and well, this baby was an infant. It was walking around, and they just let it do whatever it wanted to. And they thought it was like, cute. It came up to like some dessert I had and just like mashed it in its hands. I'm like, you gonna do something about this? I mean, yes, I know it's a small child, but like at some point in time, you have to teach it not to be a monster. Well, they weren't doing anything. They were those kind of parents that like everybody has to put on hand sanitizer before you touch the baby. It's like, you do realize it like, picks stuff up off the floor and puts it in its mouth, right? So I just picked up their child for like a split second, and that was enough to start it wailing because it didn't like me. And then just put it back down and let them deal with the screaming baby. So you guys could be onto something there. All right. And yet, despite these differences that we can see early in terms of what babies can perceive, in terms of their preferences, they really don't pick different toys until at least the 9-month mark. Until that point, they basically play with the same things.
Which is probably why all babies play with.
Yes, and that was another thing. Like even with my children, they play with the same baby toys, and there really aren't any differences. That's something that the nurture side will certainly get to. And again, what we're talking about in terms of those preferences is a distinction between preferring mechanical versus social toys.
This is where we're stopping.
Close. Right. So we'll do a little bit more on this and then wrap it up, and we'll have you in fourth hour at about the same spot. What the nurture side argues is that once we start to see these differences, right, we can think of society as driving in a wedge, right, that makes the differences right stronger and bigger as time goes on. And this starts with what's often the subconscious input from the people who care for children. So again, it's not necessarily some conspiracy to turn males and females into very different boys and girls. People just don't give it any thought at all. But there's a tendency for girls, especially in terms of what they're praised for, to focus on appearance and having a nice temperament. So being pretty and being sweet.
There's no text box on the second box.
Yeah, there isn't.
Okay, so for that, just in Cami. I'm sorry for that. I'll have to fix it, but it won't do any good for you because your PDF won't update on its own. Okay, so it's what? Oh, that one? Okay. You just go to text box. You'll be able to drop your own text there. You can shrink it down. Type in and then just make sure you go back to select so that you can click on the other text boxes.
You've done that a couple.
Yeah, it happens.
There's a lot of blanks there.
All right. Whereas boys will be praised for being strong, right? And praised for being rowdy or ornery or something like that. And then when we pick up tomorrow, we'll talk about the influence of peers, which really begins around the age of 3. Yeah, and then at this point, of course, the notes aren't due today, not due for a while. Just make sure you have those saved. Right. No, because we're going to be on this for a while. Okay. Now, I will put that last slide up for anybody who's still working on it, but I do want to point your way to the exit slip because that is about to go live.
Looks like we might need 2 more days on this.
All right. The exit slip is a carbon copy of the do now, with the exception that you have 1 attempt. You will have 7 minutes for that attempt. So, guys, again, take your time on that graph, right? As Sean has said, right? He usually gets one of those options. He picks it because the first 80% of it is right, and only those last 2 words are wrong. So make sure you go slow, take your time, especially on those questions about George Herbert Mead. And it's all on one slide of the notes. Just make sure you use that one slide of the notes. And we are still on track to go to day 11. So let's just make sure that we finish strong, avoid that temptation to talk, and whisper, or get those phones out, and we should be good. All right, and the quiz is now live.
First hour.
Yeah, they really got their act together.
So then what is that number up there? Is that even the real?
8? Yeah, no, they've done it.
I came down at the second day of the stream. If I found my computer cord.
Well, that's good.
I just picked the one off of Barbosa's floor and it's been there.
That was probably it anyway.
He just let me have it.